is awkward. I have nothing to hold on to. I usually have my tablet. When I was in seminary, I started seminary, I think, 1998. My very first class that I had signed up for, because it was a class that I could come to after work, was Christian Theology number 1. And it was taught by Professor Dr. Philip Hefner. Well, one of the things that we did in that class is we watched a movie, which you probably wondered, here the church sent me to the seminary to watch movies, which I thought was a pretty good deal. We watched a movie called Gattaca. Has anybody ever heard of the movie called Gattaca? It was a science fiction movie. The words Gattaca are the initials of the proteins of people's DNAs. Those are those 4 proteins that make up all of our DNA. And the movie was about people in the futuristic world who were considered invalid. Today, if you think about in our lifetimes, who we have considered as people that are invalid. They're not validated by just being a person. Certainly we could think of times in our history of slavery, where we thought of a certain group of people as less than human, as invalid. Certainly maybe Asian people, Hispanic people, people who are awkward, as I mentioned to the kids, people with mental disorders. We consider them something less than human, invalid. And in this movie Gattaca, this young man just happened to be born of a system that wasn't proper for his time. He was actually conceived by 2 parents in a loving family relationship because, see, at their time, they would take DNA from the mother and DNA from the father. They would take out all of the DNA that was at risk for heart disease or cancer and splice their DNAs together to make a perfect human being. All the rest were considered invalid. And the invalids were relegated to menial tasks, which it's hard for me to say menial tasks because no task is meaningless. So in the movie, though, they depicted invalids as people who had to clean the bathrooms, sweep the floors, clean up the streets, which to me these jobs are all important. They're more important now than ever to keep our world clean. But they were considered invalid. And this young man had a strong desire to enter into the space program, but the only people that could enter into the space program were people of exceptional DNA. And so he came up with a plot. He found a person who was of exceptional DNA, who was in the program, who was paralyzed from a skiing accident. And he invited him to come live with him in his home. And he would take this person's DNA, he would scrape off his skin cells, pull out pieces of hair, collect his bodily fluids, all of them. And so because whenever they entered into the Space Administration building, they had to produce their DNA like an ID card to get into the building. So he would load his body up with this other person's DNA so that he could scrape his skin and get into the space program, because that was his lifelong dream. And of course the plot goes on, and how all of this works out. Even he had to commit a crime, and he had to hide it. He had fallen in love with a girl, but he had to hide his DNA because he couldn't date unless you submitted your DNA samples to the dating center. If you get a chance to watch the movie, it is quite unique about our created world. But it goes to show us that we as a people could set people aside and make them invalid for whatever reasons we choose. And oftentimes this woman who sat at the well waiting for Jesus, she was sitting there in the middle of the day because she didn't want to be with all the other women of the village because she was seen or deemed an invalid person. A lot of times people think, well, she was invalid, she had 5 husbands, she must be a harlot. She must be a woman of ill repute because she had 5 husbands and now is living with the 6th. Well, maybe she was autistic. Maybe she was withdrawn into herself and husbands just simply dismissed her because they couldn't deal with her autism or any other thing that she might have had in those days. And men were allowed to just dismiss their wives for whatever reason they wished. And maybe that's why she was separated from the rest of the community. And Jesus, who knows that the Samaritans are considered outcasts of the Jewish population, goes to sit with this woman at this well. It's bad enough to sit with a Samaritan. It's worse to sit with a woman as a Jewish rabbi. And he sits with her and speaks with her and listens to her and hears the story of her life, her troubles, her struggles. And then he says, I am he who you are looking for. And her voice goes into the village to proclaim what she had heard and seen. And now that reminded me of another story. You know, things remind me of stories. If you remember the 2008 election, President Obama was running for his first national election. He'd already gone through the primaries in Iowa and New Hampshire. And now he was getting to South Carolina. He had never ran a national convention before. And this is not about President Obama. This happened to him. And he's in South Carolina, and he's worn out. He's exhausted. He's not feeling well. It's storming down rain, and he wanted to get the support of some of the South Carolina legislators. And this woman said, if you want my support, you have to go to Greenwood, South Carolina, because that's where my constituents live, and meet them. So he drives for an hour and a half from his hotel in the pouring down rain. He's not feeling well. He was up late at night. He's tired. He gets to this event that's going to be a gathering for his presidential campaign, and there's 20 people there. 20 people. He wants to get this woman's endorsement, and there's 20 people. He says, is this a good use of my time? You know, as a presidential candidate, am I doing what is good use? And so he's feeling kind of down. And the people in the room are sensing that he's not very energetic, and he's kind of seems depressed. Well, this one woman, about middle-aged, African-American, who sees somebody in her lifetime that looks like her may be able to become president of the United States, and she starts walking around the room going, fired up, ready to go, fired up, ready to go, fired up, ready to go. And that becomes a mantra. And he says, you know, after a while I began to feel fired up. He says, after a while my attitude changed about all of this that I'm involved in, and I'm feeling fired up. It became the message for his campaign after that. All of his campaign workers said, Mr. Obama, are you fired up? And he said, ready to go. And he went around the country, you know, fired up. From this one single voice of a woman who is often seen as an outcast in our society in South Carolina, came the voice to excite the nation. Just like the woman on the well, her voice, one little voice at the well in Samaria, became the single voice in the community to fire up a community for Jesus. How much more so does our single voice matter in our world today? We sometimes think that we are just one person. What can we do? What can we do? But we are one voice committed to the love of Christ, committed to what he has taught us in this place that we gather in, gathered here at the well of living water. And that one voice can go into the community and change that community forever. And we are those voices. So are you fired up?
Ready to go.
Are you fired up?
Ready to go.
Are you fired up?
Ready to go.
Now let us sing.